Professor Ray here, and we have another invention that changed the world. And this invention is really unique because it impacted everything that we talk about: science, technology, engineering, art, mathematics. It had an impact on all of that. And what is that invention? It's the pencil. And you're thinking to yourself, what can I possibly learn about the pencil? Well, there's a lot. And how did it impact the world? It allowed us to document the science, the technology, the engineering, the art, and the mathematics that was developed over all these years. So we'll go through a little bit of history on this and show some examples, and you'll find out that the pencil was indeed an invention that changed the world. Written communication has been around for at least 3,000 years. If we go all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, we find clay tablets written in an alphabet called cuneiform. Now, if you look at cuneiform, interesting thing, there's not a lot of curves in there, because if you tried to write with a pen or a pencil into that clay, it tended to break the clay. So instead of writing, they actually took reeds, cut them in certain shapes, and they would push the reed down in to make indentations. Cuneiform alphabet was developed to make this very, very easy. But clay is not the greatest material to use, so other attempts were made, and about 1200 BC, small brushes were developed, and those small brushes would take dabs of a paint or an ink, and they would paint leaves or pieces of wood or animal skins, and that was the method of writing back then. And early Romans had a material, it was a waxy material, and again they used a reed to try to write letters into the wax. The advantage of wax was, if they made a mistake, they took the other end of the reed and they could smear the wax out because it was soft. The downside is it didn't really hold up and didn't last very well. So things like clay and leaves and wood and wax and animal skins were not the greatest writing materials. The Egyptians came along and they invented papyrus, and papyrus again was taken from reeds, and there's a whole chemical process behind that where you layer the papyrus down and cause it to basically meld together and form a sheet and almost a parchment. And that turned out to be very, very good for writing on. They could dip a pen in ink basically and write on the parchment. What happened, that got so popular they could not keep up with demand, so in Europe they couldn't get the papyrus sheets anymore, very difficult to get. They went back to animal skins. If they made a mistake writing on an animal skin with an ink, for example, they had to take a sharp object like a knife and basically scrape the skin off. So turns out in about 1564 in England, people discovered this large deposit of a material called graphite. And back then, they actually thought it was a form of lead. They called it black lead back then. So they took this graphite and they found that it could smear and actually write on things. So they cut it into thin sheets, then they cut the sheets into long pieces to make almost what we would think of as a pencil lead today. The problem was it's very brittle and break very easy. So to get around that, they would hand carve a wooden piece to insert this lead into, and basically they created what we would consider to be the first pencil. It wouldn't be until 1795 one of Napoleon's military leaders found out he could actually improve the strength of graphite if he mixed it with clay, created a pencil lead, and then put it in what's called a kiln. And a kiln's like an oven. He would get it up to about 1900 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, when you put materials in a kiln at that heat, you start getting into some interesting chemistry and physics. We won't go into that now, but suffice to say, he made a much harder pencil lead that they were able to use. And people caught on to this, and they started playing with the mixtures of the lead and the clay, and they came up with leads that we would call hard and soft leads for pencils today. And there's all kinds of those. Typically, the pencils that we use have a number on there, and it's typically a number 2, which is a somewhat soft pencil. Sometimes it'll be a number 3, and that'll be a harder pencil. It draws a lighter line. Soft pencil draws a dark line. A hard pencil draws a much lighter line. In 1790, an Austrian gentleman named Joseph Hardmuth came up with a way to create the pencil lead using a mixture of kaolin clay and graphite. And he basically followed a process very similar to what Napoleon's fellow did, and he basically created a company now that was making pencils. His kids took that in 1848 and they moved it from Austria and they moved it to the Czech Republic. And the town was called Česká Budějovice. So they moved it down there and the company was called Kohinoor. And in fact, they're still in business today. And I have a set of pencils I got when I was over in that area, made by the Kohinoor company. So they're still in business. They still make pencils. But one of the sons, or one of the relatives, was Franz Hardmuth. And he came up with the first, what we would call the pencil hardness scale. And if you're an artist, you're probably very familiar that there are drawing pencils out there, and they have different ratings on it. And Franz Hardmuth is the one that came up with that. For example, there was a range of what he called very hard pencils, and he labeled them 10H, 9H, 8H, 7H, 6H, 5H, 4H, 3H, 2H, and H. And I have some of those here. I'll attempt to do a little demo on this pad just to give you an idea. So here's a 4H, and I'll try to draw a line. I'll try to use the same pressure each time. And I just drew a line with a 4H pen. That's a fairly hard pen. This is a 2H. It's hard, but it's lighter than this. It's easier to make a little bit darker line with a 2H pen. And we'll take an H pen, and it gets just a little bit darker still. It is said that the letter H does not stand for hard. It stands for Hardmuth's last name. Franz Hardmuth, the H stood for Hardmuth. At least that's the way the story goes. Before we get into the soft pens, there was an intermediate pen. It was called an F lead. So if I use an F lead, it's a little bit darker. The F is said to stand for Franz, his first name. So we have the H pen stands for Hardmuth, the F stands for Franz. Then we transition over and we get into the softer pens. There's an HB pen, or HB pencil, that's a little softer. And then we start stepping up. We go to a B. A 2B. Each time it gets just a little bit darker. A 4B. A 3B rather. We have a 4B here. Then we have a 5B. Notice they're getting darker as I go. A 6B. And the softest that I have is an 8B. So different hardnesses, they're different amounts of graphite and clay mixed together and basically put in a kiln to form these different types of pencils. So why do we need so many pencils? Why do we need so many hardnesses? Well, there's different applications, and especially if you're an artist, you can start mixing these different hardnesses together. Then you can do things like take an eraser or take a soft piece of cloth or toilet paper or Q-tip, and you can start blending things together, and you can get some rather interesting shading, like this American flag that I drew. And I did that all from pencils and using a little piece of toilet paper to help blend things together to get all the different grayscale levels. And I'm not an artist. A really good artist could do a great job with all of this. So let's talk about the term pencil. The term pencil comes from the Latin word pensillus. And it means little tail, and it actually comes from the brushes with the fine points that they used to make. The word graphite comes from the Greek word graphene, and it means to write. And if you think about graph paper, graphite, graph paper, we're talking about writing with all of that. And interesting tidbit, pencils can write in zero gravity. So pencils were on the first US and Russian space voyages because they can write in zero gravity. Pencils can also write underwater. If you didn't know it, you can try it. The problem is paper doesn't stand up to water all that well. So one of the things I want to show is a little demo here. I'm going to move these pencils. Move the pad with my different levels of grayscale pencil on it. You might wonder, most pencils have 6 sides. They're called hexagons. There's actually an engineering reason for that. But first I'll show you a pencil that does not have 6 sides. It's round, right here. And if I put it on this board, and if I lift up this board, pencil rolls. If I take this pencil that has 6 sides and put it on the board, and I raise it up, it doesn't roll. The 6 sides were put there to give flat spots so that the pencil would not roll off of desks and tables. Now, one thing I want to talk about is a myth. Some people say, oh, you can get lead poisoning from a pencil. That is not true. Lead is a completely different element. Graphite comes from the element carbon, and carbon is non-toxic. Lead is toxic. So you will not get lead poisoning from the graphite in a pencil. And when I go back, when it was first discovered, like I mentioned, they found graphite, they started calling it black lead because that's what they thought it really was. So there you are. We have the pencil. It's an invention that changed the world. It helped document scientific, technical, engineering, and mathematical studies over the last couple hundred years. Very, very important tool. You'll never look at one the same again. So stay tuned for another video that I'll do later because the topic of graphite is very interesting, especially in this day and age where they're developing materials called graphene and they're using it in a technology called nanoparticles. And that comes from graphite in a slightly different form. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This is Professor Ray signing off.